Good morning. Good morning. We will start. Everybody take their seats, please. Miss Kristen has a shotgun up here, and she's been shocking me all morning because we're 5 minutes late already, so we're going to get started. Thank everybody for coming today. We had a very interesting meeting yesterday. We learned an awful lot about an awful lot of stuff. We had a great interaction with the board. We had great interaction with the presenters, and it was a remarkable day, I thought. And today's going to be just as good. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Mr. Bruce, who's going to introduce the speakers this morning.
All right. Well, thank you and welcome again, everybody, this morning. Today we're going to start the morning off with a panel discussion and on talking about healthy horses and healthy rangelands, and it's kind of a follow-up from I think a lot of the discussion we had yesterday. So I feel very honored that. Fred, do you want to go over the rules of the room first again?
Is there anybody here that was not here yesterday to hear the rules of the room? I think, if you don't mind, I think before we have a public comment period, I'll have you do it at that point. Is that okay? All right. Thank you.
One quick thing. We do have Dr. Barry Perriman and Sue McDonald will be on the phone, so if you have any questions for them or whatever, we just want to remember that they're both going to be participating. So.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. So, again, I'm really excited about this panel. I think this was going to be one of the best parts of this meeting. I think it's already been a great meeting so far, but and I feel really honored that we got the 4 people that we got to come today. Some came from pretty far away, and some are fairly local, but and we'll provide that conduit and context of the complex management of public lands in a multiple use environment. So I'm going to introduce the folks all, and then they've kind of drawn numbers, and they're going to go in that. So the order that I introduce them is the order that they're going to present. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Nancy Perry. Nancy works for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals. Nancy, she is their Vice President for Government Relations, overseeing legislative and regulatory policy at the local, state, and federal levels. She has over 20 years leading national policy for animal protection. Nancy has degrees from Wellesley, UC Northridge, and a law degree from Lewis and Clark College in beautiful Portland, Oregon. Being an Oregonian, I had to say that. The next presenter will be Alan Bass. Alan is currently the Rangeland Management Specialist, serving as the Range Program Lead here for the BLM in the Utah State Office. Alan has been in this position since 2015, and he is a native son of Utah. He has degrees in botany and rangeland resources from Weber State and Utah State University. Third speaker we'll hear from today is Reg Johnson. Reg is currently the county liaison for the Governor's Public Lands Coordinating Office. Reg has assisted in all 29 Utah counties to create county resource management plans for 28 natural resources identified by the Utah legislature. Reg and his team have then taken those county plans and has drafted a state resource management plan based on the desired outcomes of those 29 county plans and the state agency mandates. And this plan was formally adopted in 2018. Reg has been tasked with also managing the grazing resolution team here in the state. And again, Reg enjoys spending time in Utah's abundant outdoor resources and with his wife and 2 daughters. And then lastly is Dr. Stephen Peterson. He is a professor of rangeland landscape ecology at Brigham Young University. He's been in that position for 12 years. He has also been working on free-roaming horse research for over 13 years. He was on the committee and an author of the National Academy of Sciences report that was published in 2013. He earned his PhD, again, another Oregon connection, his PhD from Oregon State University in Rangeland Resources in 2004 under the direction of Dr. Tamsin Stringham. And welcome to all of you, and we look forward to a good discussion here. And you guys each will have about, I'd say, no longer than 10 minutes, so Dan, keep them on track, okay? All right, thank you.
Yeah, if you even just can give me 1 minute, I think that's when I'm going to have to.
Well, I need to warn you all, he does have a cattle prod, and he used it on me a lot yesterday, so just be aware.
So, yeah, you push the button, yours is working, Nancy.
Yeah, I think I'm live. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, wait, so, yeah.
Just so all of our panelists know, this is all being live streamed.
Sure.
Yeah, we need to try to get it captured on the internet.
How's that? Okay, great.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful honor of being here before the advisory board and having this amazing opportunity over the last few days of so much really good conversation with so many people who are truly interested in working through this challenge with wild horses and burros. And it's really a delight for me, and it's been very energizing. So as you heard, I'm Nancy Perry. I'm with the ASPCA. My organization is the first animal welfare organization to be formed on the continent. We're pretty old. We've been at it for a long time. Our focus has not been specifically on wild horses until fairly recently. And some of the reason for that is we felt that the opportunities weren't there for making a genuine difference. We were worried that it was just too great a challenge. And in the last couple of years, we have started to see real opportunity. And that is why we have started to engage on this issue. And that's why I titled this Opportunities and Obligations, because I thought it was important to share with you where we saw ways forward and some of the potential obstacles to moving forward. So that's where I will focus my comments. One of the first things that we determined a few years ago when we started having these conversations about wild horses, and they involved going out to Nevada and meeting with stakeholders and sitting down with folks who had dramatically different views on this topic, was that if we focused on where we didn't agree, those conversations fell apart rapidly. If we focused on where we agreed, we actually found we had a lot more common ground than we even knew walking in the door. And that was what led to what I think were the really fruitful conversations for us. The common goals that we see on this slide don't represent everyone's core value. Every one of those boxes may not be where our mission falls most specifically. Obviously, humane treatment is our wheelhouse at the ASPCA, but we do care about ecosystem health. We care about the rangeland being able to support the lives of millions of other animals. And we certainly know that any plan forward that's going to result in long-term success for wild horses and burros will have to be fiscally responsible. And we appreciate that. And most importantly, we really appreciate the way that this conversation in the last year has shifted to be thinking in terms of genuinely long-term solutions. I think it's been hard to get there. We all want this to be something that can be resolved quickly. But we all know if we're looking hard at this problem that it requires a long-term commitment. And working in Washington, D.C., I know that that is not always a given, and it's actually a pretty big challenge that we all face together. Getting any administration to commit to something that lives beyond them is difficult, and Congress doesn't think that way either. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We do think after sitting down for a few years that there is a way forward. It led us to sit down with other humane organizations, national welfare groups, as well as those stakeholders in Nevada and Utah, those states obviously representing very large chunks of the larger population of wild horses. That led us to put a proposal on paper. And the minute you write a proposal and put it on paper, it starts to change. And so we've called it a draft proposal, and it's continued to be a draft. But we did finally force ourselves to submit it to the Secretary last October, so a year ago, again as a draft. And we've had some very robust, productive conversations with the BLM. working from the very top. We've had several conversations where the secretary was in the room, and we've had conversations with the folks that work with the numbers and crunch them and understand the dynamics on the range in a very detailed way. And that's been incredibly helpful in terms of figuring out some of the logistics of putting forward any kind of proposal. Those conversations continue. We have not come to any final commitment or agreement around it, but our proposal genuinely focuses on how to move forward, what the logistics should look like, and a non-lethal approach to managing wild horses. That's obviously very key for us, but we think it's key for success for any proposal. Obviously, this is a time-sensitive situation, so we're hoping that moving forward, we can move from the discussion phase to the implementation phase as quickly as possible to avoid more years of full crops that add to our inability to address this challenge. Our proposal is basically, the details aren't necessarily the important part, it's the overall scheme. And again, nothing all that new under the sun here, but I think what we're proposing is the synergistic effect of committing to 4 different prongs of management together. So first and foremost, we are willing to argue for robust gathers, roundups and gathers. That's something that's been difficult for the humane community to support, but at this point in time, it feels like the way to get out ahead and to start to work on prevention. In order to be effective in that prong of the plan, we need to prioritize where the rangeland has been degraded, where wildlife is impacted, where there are T&E species, focusing too on a regional approach instead of an HMA-based approach feels important because, as we all know and you've been talking about in the last few days, those herds are large herds in some places and they're not just HMA-based. Coupled with that is the need to be very committed to fertility control, more than ever historically the agency has been able to be. And this is a big stretch, and we realize that it's a big stretch. But we believe that treating at least 80% of the horses on the range is going to be critical to realize the benefits of prevention in this plan. And as far as the particulars, we can certainly go into them. We believe that we have an effective tool with PZP if it's properly applied. I realize there are all kinds of arguments around that. I appreciate that. I think there are other innovative technologies that we've heard about in the last 24 hours in this room that are really exciting, and there's a lot of prospects that will come online. Waiting for those prospects to be perfect doesn't feel feasible. I think we should start with what the tools that we have at our disposal now and bring new things online as they're appropriate. We have a real interest in making sure all those tools that are brought online are humane and effective, but we're very interested in being pragmatic too about whatever fertility control methods are applied. Obviously, if you're going to gather and remove, you're going to have to relocate those horses that are coming off the range. And one area that we think there are some potential streamlining benefits is in the long-term holding area. There have been a lot of interested parties in helping with this problem, but given the uncertainty around whether or not the agency would move forward with any lethal methods of population control, that's been a bit of an obstacle to bringing some of those potential partnerships forward. So we believe that if we can commit to a non-lethal, synergistic, multi-prong approach, we can see long-term, cost-effective pasturing, maybe lifetime, so we're not transporting horses and incurring more costs, that would result from some public-private arrangements. And so that's obviously an area we still have a lot to explore on, but I think that there's real potential here for saving money and allocating resources towards the on-the-range work that has to happen. And then finally, perhaps the most fun prong of the management plan is talking about adoptions. Everyone would like to talk about adoptions. I've been really encouraged to hear about some of the innovative ideas that are really taking hold now around the adoption program. We at the ASPCA are huge proponents of adoption in many different realms, and we're pretty good at marketing And we have offered the administration to our opportunities for leaning in, our social networks, to help mobilize and market horses. We've done research around the horse community generally that shows that there are a lot more homes out there than previously believed. Edge Research did a study with us 1.5 years ago showing that there are 2.3 million Americans who, if they learn about the need, have the resources now to take in horses and the desire to. It's about finding them, and marketing obviously is something that the agency's already leaning in on. So that's very exciting. I think we can add to that if we get the energy of the humane community behind a proposal. So those are the guts of what we're proposing. The underlying themes here are urgency, obviously prevention, getting out on the range, and really having a commitment to the rangeland work. You know, it's easy to talk about adoptions and finding a way out through adopting, but we absolutely cannot solve these problems through the adoption angle. So I think that prevention on the range work is going to be critical. Streamlining is something we already talked about. That's an important element of cost savings. And then finally, this marketing work that's already underway is really important, and I think there's a lot to be done there. The holistic aspect of managing wild horses is going to be critical. It's so easy to think, well, the next new thing is going to be our saving grace. And I think, you know, we've got to really be committed to and determined to implement all elements of this plan together, or else we're not going to realize the benefits that could be realized. How much? A minute? Okay. So some of the challenges are building trust and making sure we can bring the right partners along on this plan. The new sales policy, though it doesn't relate to rangeland work directly, could create a backdoor to selling horses to slaughter. I am assured that's not the intent of it. But the problem is many of the provisions that were just stripped out in July and the IM that was put out then were put in place in response to the incident in 2014 when 1,700 Mustangs did go to slaughter. So having those provisions, making sure we're not sending too many horses too quickly, having a time limit, having some ability to report concerns, having a database that helps identify problematic buyers, all those things are really critical, and I think we need to go back and look at that IM and make some adjustments around it. And I think what it does is it jeopardizes support for moving forward if we don't have clear understanding that those horses aren't going to move out the back end. Roundup protocols we should revisit, because every time there is an incident on the range, there's certainly going to be problems with roundups. It's unavoidable. But having those comprehensive animal welfare protocols reviewed, having training for contractors will help avoid some of those problems, and it's critical for building trust. And then finally, the political realities that I look at when I work on this issue and have been lobbying around it for 15 years. We cannot do nothing, but we cannot kill as a management option. We can certainly euthanize horses that need to be euthanized, but killing healthy wild horses to control the population will not be supported in Washington or among Americans. And then finally, any sales for slaughter explicitly or any schemes that result in that are going to erode trust in the agency. And we have an opportunity right now to build trust. So I think we have great opportunities, I think, working together and collectively and really emphasizing where we have commonality is going to be the way that we're going to get where we need to get. And I'm glad that we're in this for the long haul. So thank you so much for all of your generosity and work on this.
Thank you very much. Does any of the board have any questions or comments? Ben, now I want to point something out. We're going to have to be brief. And so if I call your hand, don't get mad at me.
The private partnership approach to take care of the horses that would be gathered. You know, if we decided to try to do roundups and fertility control to get to AML within 8 years, that's going to mean probably gathering 100,000 horses off the range. Mm-hmm. You're looking at somewhere in the ballpark between $100 to $150 million annually to feed and house those animals. Where would that money come from, and how would we as the board or the BLM have some sort of certainty in knowing that that $150 million expense is going to last for the next 15 to 25 years for the rest of that horse's lifetime?
That is an important question, and definitely one that's asked by a lot of folks. We won't have certainty about anything that we do, but we have to have a strong enough plan that we can look at where that money should be spent, how we can make savings. We've been working with a biologist and an economist to model out options for gathering this many this year and how many years it would take of gathering. All the gathering will need to be robust, but I don't think that means lifetime sanctuary for all of those horses that come off the range. I think we can make savings if we are not moving horses to long-term holding and then moving them again and again in that process. I think there are cost savings to not doing that. So having very long-term, very stable contracts with long-term providers is a savings that we'll make. That's not enough. We have to also build up our adoptions so that we're not putting every horse out there. Some of them are not going to go through the adoption program, but I bet we can do a lot more with adoptions. I don't think it's the only answer, though. I think it's the combination of those things that will save. And then obviously, if we really are on the range employing preventative measures, we're going to realize benefits there too. So it's sort of that, it's not one thing, it's all of these things together that will make the savings that we need. I also think one more thing, I think there's a lot of interest and energy in a solution that involves unlikely bedfellows in Washington. And so finding opposing parties that will agree to something will unleash some more funding, because I think they're tired of this issue too, and they would like to be done with it, but they just don't want to be responsible for something bad happening to the horses. So I think if we have a positive solution, we'll see some positive benefits, and even private funders might lean in with us.
Can you give us an example of entity that could commit $20 million annually for the next 15 years?
We have not gotten far enough to identify specific corporate entities that would be in that position. I know that there are some entities like the American Mustang Foundation is one of the potential long-term holders. They've already got some facilities online. There are going to be others that come forward if we are able to strike a deal. But I think we're a little premature to have examples of those corporate entities. I think there's an appetite out there, though.
You spoke of the different critical components were gathers and removers. Excuse me, can't speak. Gathers and removals, fertility control, relocation, and adoptions. Those were the 4 different areas that you spoke of. And then on one of your next slides, I saw one of the things you'd like to see happen is to minimize helicopter gathers. How do you propose to accomplish all this work and treat 80% of horses on the range while at the same time minimizing helicopter gathers? Yeah,
well, I think the helicopter gathers are always going to be necessary in certain geographies, and we appreciate that. I think finding the areas where they're not necessary and always employing other methods will help avoid some of the incidents that erode trust in the agency's management, and I think that's critical. But I'm not suggesting that we don't do helicopter gathers. I think there's very little opportunity for eliminating them altogether, given the geographies the horses live on.
What is your big opposition or concern with helicopter gathers?
I think most of the incidents that have happened in recent days, months, years, that gain a lot of attention for citizens who are watching this issue are incidents that typically happen due to the stress of helicopter gathers and, frankly, some inappropriate behavior on the contractor's part. And there are animal welfare guidelines that just aren't always followed perfectly. I think there's no perfect scenario, but I think we can do better than we've always done. So I think there's
Stephen,
places to go.
That's enough.
I would just like to finish one comment. I'd like you just to recognize that all of the things that you've recommended are going to require a greatly increased amount of helicopter gathers versus decreasing them.
I think you're right about that.
Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nancy, I applaud what you guys are trying to do. An awful lot of the comments and your strategy that you just spelled out this morning was actually discussed this morning prior to this, and I applaud that. One of the things that, in talking about the adoption side of it, I think we all embrace the fact that we would love to see, as opposed to long-term holding, we would love to see an increase in adoptions. I've been an advocate for international adoption since I've been on this board, and I know that a lot of the arguments against it. I've heard them, many of them already. Mm-hmm. However, I think we lose sight of what the overall goal is on our side if we eliminate that because due to some bad actors on the other end. And my question is to you is that would your organization have an interest in brokering through websites and whatnot, brokering international adoption to make sure that the other end of the receiving end of the adoptions is appropriate? You know, in other words, if we had bad actors, I think that your term on the other end of it, and you know their intent is we can determine that it's less than beneficial for the horses. What we're looking for is an organization to broker those adoptions that would make sure that the overall impact would be onto the horses would be beneficial, and because there's a huge demand especially in Western Europe for it for horses.
That's really interesting, and I'm not very versed on what the demand looks like, where they would be going, and that's a good conversation to have. I will just say the ASPCA is a domestically focused organization, so we don't have any real connections externally in outside of the U.S. It's just our mission is American focused. So we would not be in a good position to offer much support there. I will say I just have a lot more faith in our ability to track and understand where those horses go. I'm sure you've heard this before. I feel a lot more comfortable keeping them in this country because then I believe we have laws in place that would help us if we did see problems. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be potential for someone good taking horses and giving them good jobs in some other country, but it's much more difficult to ensure their safety the further away they go and how far outside the reach of our law they would be. So I just have hesitations around it. I also would note that we're working towards a country where we don't have horse slaughter, and there are a lot of countries that do, and that's a quick slide down for horses in other countries. So all those things would give me pause, but it's a conversation that we should keep having, I think.
Thank you.
So Nancy, thanks for coming in. I'm really excited that you all have decided to take this on because you bring tremendous resources and expertise. But I noticed that several times during your presentation, you stated you all were opposed to non-lethal solutions. And it's my understanding that ASPCA traditionally supports euthanasia of dogs and cats that are not adoptable. So what's the difference?
Oh, that's a great question. And we take that position on dogs and cats through the sheltering community that exists, and at the same time, we have been actively engaging with the shelter community in this country to really encourage them to move towards higher and higher what we call live release rates, to get to the point where euthanasia is not employed for space purposes, meaning it's not employed as a population control technique for dogs and cats. And by being a bit of a gadfly on that, we have seen live release rates go way up in our shelter community in this country. So I think it's important for our voice to be in favor of pushing everyone away from utilizing euthanasia lightly or conveniently. And one of my concerns is it's been a challenge for the agency to get comfortable with and feel confident about on-the-range management and prevention on the range. It just hasn't been the strong suit so far for the BLM. And my worry would be, not only would I not feel good about, I feel like we have a real obligation. We've created this scenario. And I feel we have an obligation to every one of those horses to try to avoid them paying the price ultimately for it. So that would be a concern, but I also worry that it would become too easy. And I think if we have an escape hatch of euthanasia, I'm not sure it would ever go away, just the way politics works. You know, when you start down a road, it's hard to undo it. And so I would hate to see us go down that road if we have any other option in the entire world to exercise.
Ginger?
Hi, Nancy.
Hi,
Thanks for
Ginger.
being here. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
Does your proposal presuppose that you would be going to the AML of 26,710 horses, which many organizations believe is unrealistically low to sustain certain small populations?
Yeah, there's so much concern and anxiety about AML, whether it's the right number, how to think about AML. I think we start after the AML conversation with how we engage. Not to say there isn't good, important dialogue around whether or not the AML number is the right number. We get that it's a calculation, and it may need adjustment. Our interest is in recognizing that right now the agency has set that as AML, and their job is to work towards it. So as we enter this conversation, we're sort of post AML and saying, all right, well, that's AML. We're not in a position right now to challenge that. So instead, we're working towards it. But I think everyone I've talked to from every level of the agency has acknowledged that that precise number may not be the critical piece here. Getting close to it, getting more in the range of AML is what's important. So I'm not saying that getting to AML isn't important, but I think that if we got to 35,000, I think we'd be having a very different conversation right now. I feel like some of that anxiety would allay if we didn't have 82,000 or whatever we have on the range right now. So that's kind of where we're not very focused on it, and we're not really trying to argue about it. Does that make sense, Ginger? I don't want to avoid your question. I don't know that we're that focused on AML.
Thank you, Nancy. That was,
Thanks, Nancy.
I really appreciate your program that you did. I enjoyed our drinking coffee this morning. But I just have one question for you, and I just want you to, based on your slide that you had about you're not in favor of BLM being able to adopt out 25 horses.
Right, the sales. Mm-hmm.
Due to an incident that happened in 2014 that,
Right.
And it wasn't a broad incident, it was happened with one person and all that. Based on that approach to that, we don't need to issue driver's license to anybody because there's accidents that happen and people get killed, and that's bad. You know what I'm saying? And that really bothers me because this program of giving up to 25 horses can really help out an awful lot. And just automatically assuming that they're going to take them to slaughter because of an isolated incident that really shouldn't have happened, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
There was lots of mistakes made. And I agree with you that we need to come together, and I agree with a lot that you did, but that right there just kind of stuck in my craw just a little bit.
Yeah, and I was rushing a bit. I wish it would be great to have a longer conversation about this, but here's some framing for that. We support the idea of the right adopters or buyers getting larger numbers of horses. We've seen that happening even before this sales IM came into place. So I think when that policy came in, I don't think it precludes large-scale adoptions or sales, but I think that the sales IM is raising concerns because I think really those protections are pretty minimal, ensuring that.
Well, now, prior to this, if I wanted to adopt my 4 horses, that was my limit for 12
6
months
months,
until
yeah.
they 12 months until they got titles, and now I can do more than that. So if I have a training stable where I specialize in Mustangs.
Right.
I can go get me 25 horses, and I can train these, and I can let other people have the benefit of owning a Mustang. I mean, that was the intent. I mean, I guess I'm kind of, it kind of bothers me because I'm always a positive looking thing. I never try to look
Right.
at negative. This glass is almost full. It's not almost empty. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And one isolated case, and it was wrong. It was terribly wrong. It was terribly wrong. And I you know, and I agree. But having that approach where we're going to restrict everybody and limit on one isolated case, I don't think that's right.
Yeah, I think from what I understand, even before this went into place, this new policy, it was quite possible to get a large number of horses.
But it would have to go up to Washington, D.C. and get them to sign off on it. Nobody on a local level or a state level could do it.
Right.
And so if I'm a cowboy and I want to train horses, I ain't going to visit with Washington, D.C. They don't know anything. They don't know which end of a horse gets up first. I told you I was going to ask
Some
you
of them
that,
do.
and I didn't, did I? So,
Yeah, I hear you. I don't think we're that far apart on this.
okay.
I don't think we
All
have
right.
that
Okay,
different
well,
an
let's,
opinion.
you and I can
Yeah.
talk about this later if you will, but, so we
Sure.
got to get on. But that's just, I really appreciate the time and effort that you spend, and it's exciting to me.
Yeah.
Having served on this board for 5 years and seeing where we were 5 years ago, where you and I wouldn't even talk to each other. I mean, I didn't know you then, but since you were ASPSN, I'm a cowboy. We wasn't going to talk, but
Oh,
to where this morning we drank coffee and had a good time. So see, that's
Thank you.
benefits.
Yeah,
That's benefits.
absolutely. It's been
Okay.
great being here. And I should mention the Mustang Heritage Foundation has a lot more capacity if we can all find the funding for them. So they're a good example of a large
part of the
scale.
reason
I
is
know.
that right there. So see, and
I
so
think we're sitting really close on that.
all right, good deal. All right, thank you very much, Bruce. You want to go on with the? Okay, Alan. I promise you'll probably ask as many questions.
I was going to say, Mr. Chairman, be careful what you promise, right? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. For good or for bad, I'm not going to talk about horses. We're going to talk about livestock. Whether that helps your meeting or not, that's for you to determine. And as you all eloquently noted yesterday, because I'm the program lead in the state of Utah, I also have Gus War. So I do not have to worry about horses in the state of Utah or dealing with them. I just have Gus, and enough said. And that's very comforting from a range program lead to do so. So while I go about this presentation, again, those will be some interaction or intertwining of horses and livestock, but I'll pretty much stick to how the agency deals with livestock grazing on public lands, but think about how horses are managed maybe with or without the same kind of regulations or direction. So I'll go over, I thought it'd be good to have a bit of a historical context, and we'll go about kind of where we are today in the administration, some relevant acts that guide and direct us in that administration. And of course, we'll talk about the myriad of regulations that we have in order to administer grazing on public lands. So as we know, grazing is long in the tooth. It's been around for a very long time, along with the horses. They go back long before regulation and a lot of things were in place. And we know after the Civil War, there was a big push to go west. The next little box comes up, the saying, "Go west, young man, and grow up with the country." And so all these post-Civil War, they left and they went out, and you can see in the picture a group of livestock gathering crew. They picked up strays or whatever else, and they went out and they got to the forage first, and they made their livelihood. And many, many, many folks did this, young and old and in between, because it was a very low cost to start up an operation, and there was plenty of free forage and unregulated at that point in time. Over the next several decades, this was occurring more and more and more, and it began to be somewhat controversial. It began to have interactions, the adage of, the sheep and the cowman do not get along. Basically, the regulatory mechanism of the day was a long rope and a six-shooter. And that created a lot of hostility. And then as you progress towards the early 1920s and 30s, or even the 1900s, you had settlement occurring, those coming west that weren't so much interested in livestock grazing, but they were homesteading. Ranchers also homesteaded, and that started to create this interaction we still have today of some cried for regulation. Even the industry itself of livestock and cattle and sheep operators kind of went to their congressman and said, we need to do something. There needs to be some sort of management of who goes where and when and how we can get along on this public range. And so we had the Taylor Grazing Act. The story was that this was signed on the day that one of the Dust Bowls settled on Washington, D.C., and that was the final straw. So they put pen to paper and said, we've got to do something to arrest the deterioration and degradation of the landscape out west. Some of the parts I highlighted here, sections of the Taylor Grazing Act, you can obviously read that. The grazing districts were created. The concept of a 10-year grazing permit was instituted. This concept of landowners adjacent to these grazing districts who either owned water rights or were in the business of livestock held this concept of first priority or preference that we use today. That's a superior position in order to get that grazing privilege on public lands. Authorized those issuing permits for cooperative agreements, arrangements to do range improvements, and that's a really big deal even today, that many of our range improvements, and you heard yesterday about water being a major limiting factor, those range improvements are put in, maintained, and provided for by permittees on the landscape, many of those from which their private water rights are developed from. And so at that time, the Grazing Service began this effort to adjudicate. And in the 1930s and 40s, we went through a process, and the highlighted in red is the most important, of the who, where, when, and how much to graze. So there was a real effort to kind of control or manage, if you will, the grazing on public lands. The where, the allotment concept, the when, the season of use, the who, the grazing permittee, and how much was done. But you'll notice there on the third bullet point, the concept of this where and when was based almost entirely on the traditional and customary practice. So they basically asked the rancher permittee, where have you been grazing, how much you've been doing, and they basically gave them a permit for that. We then later learned in the 50s and 60s that wasn't quite so sustainable. As people came from the east to the west, they were used to dealing with AUMs, animal unit months, the amount of forage it takes to sustain an animal per acre. Out west, it's how many acres per AUM can we sustain. So in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the Bureau at that time then went through a secondary kind of adjudication process to kind of fine tune and further address the traditional and customary practices, because that's kind of what got us in the problem in the first place. During that same time, we have a myriad of other acts that come into play that the grazing was trying to deal with and address, and we're expected to manage livestock grazing in compliance with all of these things. And some of the ones that we'll kind of focus on today that stand out is the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act and the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Public Range Lands Improvement Act, and it does also talk about horses in that act. So to go back to the Taylor Grazing Act, you'll see that the purpose of that was to stop injury to the public grazing lands by preventing overgrazing and soil deterioration. And the next part for me is the critical part, to provide for their orderly use, improvement, and development. I think orderly use there is a key point. And again, thinking about management of horses, how do we do orderly use? And it's also to stabilize the livestock industry. There's no doubt that was not intended to reduce or restrict or impede that, but to help manage so that could be sustainable. It also talks about, I believe in Section 3 of the Taylor Grazing Act, that it's part to recognize and acknowledge that the grazing shall be adequately safeguarded, but it goes on to say the creation of these grazing districts or the issuance of a permit pursuant to the provisions of the Act shall not create right, title, or interest or estate in or on to the land. So it's a privilege, it's an opportunity to use public lands. But the Bureau recognizes this partnership and relationship, that it's a long-standing and an important aspect of public lands. And so then we get to the BLM's Organic Act. And I apologize, this violates all kinds of PowerPoint rules. I understand, Dr. Peterson. You can read flip Joanne, but I've got in red the parts that I think are important. That the purpose of multiple use is to utilize in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. And that's going to be debated long after we leave today, forever. When you start talking about people's values, again, the comment was made yesterday that the horses is a passionate program. I believe livestock grazing can be as equally passionate and controversial at times. And the next part as well, provide sufficient latitude for periodic adjustments. And I think that's key for the Bureau under the multiple use and sustained yield management guidelines. We need to be able to have that sufficient latitude for periodic adjustments, whatever that might be. And the end result and the medium and in the beginning of that management concept for all the uses that occur on public lands, we need to be able to have that latitude to adjust and revisit and rethink and move forward with new concepts to address what I believe is, with the mission of the Bureau is ultimately land health management. We need to make, I think that's the one goal that we all agree with, as Nancy presented, that's one common ground we agree on. And I think that's one thing is through management we can focus on with all the resources. And then last, harmonious and coordinated management of the various resources without permanent impairment of the productivity of that land. And so we're trying to do all of these things, provide food and fiber, soil health, and economic stability. So thanks to Tammy Howell out of the Salt Lake Field office. This is a picture of the Aniki herd. I believe you guys visited that yesterday. In the Public Range Improvement Act, it talks about still a concern about the public lands being in unsatisfactory condition. And in this act, we highlight the range improvement funds and an 8100 fund in the Bureau's option that comes from grazing receipts, where we want that money to go back out on the ground for range improvements. And that's where we partner with the programs you heard yesterday with the Grazing Improvement Program, with the Watershed Restoration Initiative, WRI, to put water out on the ground or other improvements to better distribute livestock, and wildlife benefit from that, and I believe wild horses benefit from that as well. Interesting, PREA also took the time to amend the 71 Act, and it talks about how the Act is doing a good job for protecting horses from being captured or branding, and I apologize, white might not be the best color for that. Looks a little better on your computer screen when you're closer. But it says certain amendments are necessary, and then it goes on to say, because the horses exceed the carrying capacity of the range, pose a threat to their own habitat, fish, wildlife, recreation, water, soil conservation, domestic livestock grazing, and other rangeland values. I think that to me highlighted still the need for management. I think if you read the Wild Horse and Burro Act, the word management occurs over 20 times, and that's the focus we need to have is this multi-faceted management for multiple use purposes. So today, the livestock grazing program is we issue grazing permits. We monitor those permits, thank you, for compliance with those terms and conditions in order to meet land health, or fundamentals of rangeland health concerns. We work with our local partners through consultation. We bill for that use as set out through the Data Grazing Act and PREA, and we transfer those permits around from permittee to permittee. Just to where we are today, there's roughly just under 18,000 permits or leases. There's 12.3 million livestock AUMs. In 2017, there was 8.8 of those AUMs that are billed or sold, if you will, and 3.5 million AUMs in non-use. And to explain a little bit with non-use, there are a myriad of reasons why that could be. That could be from emergency stabilization, as you heard yesterday. If we do a seeding, we want to arrest that from livestock. We ask that they come off for a period of time. It could be from personal business uses. Perhaps the permittee wants to sell a few head and go to Hawaii for a month, and so they don't use that full permit and they can take non-use. Certainly one of those aspects, as we heard yesterday, and as you watch that bull hog work on those trees, is if there's no understory until we get to those treatments and restore that vegetation, there isn't those AUMs. In addition to many times, because something has gone in and used that forage prior to that, when and where of that permitted livestock use, there isn't anything there, and that ranges from the use of wildlife and wild horses, that those permittees are also taking non-use for those reasons. This is just a graph to kind of explain it, but I did want to highlight, so on your right, that you're looking at the screen, you can see that 1953 is the first date on the bottom. It goes to 2017. That decline is from that second era of that adjudication, when we realized, giving the permits based on what they historically were doing wasn't working for the public lands and land health, and so that's that decline. And so it's just this is a graphical representation of that numbers that you saw in the previous slide there. The 12 million AUMs and about 8.8 being actually used. So now I'm going to go quickly through the regulations. This is also very kind of mind-numbing. You can read those. I would encourage you, if you do look those up on the Code of Federal Regulations online. Make sure you find the 2005 version. We had some regulations enjoined in 2006, but they have not been corrected electronically, and we've even had judges use the wrong regulations. So if you want to read them, please use the 10-1-2005 version. So the 4100, 43 CFR 4100 is what governs the grazing administration for the BLM, and there's a lot more in the regulations. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but it talks about us doing multiple use and sustained yield in accordance with applicable land use plans. We're allowed to make changes with permitted use, where the authorized officer shall periodically review the permitted use and shall make changes as needed to maintain, manage, or improve rangeland productivity, and to assist in restoring ecosystems to proper functioning conditions. I think that's critical. Our fundamentals of rangeland health don't ask us to go for pre-European settlement or a potential natural community. We need to manage these under the multiple use guidelines for functioning ecosystems. That's, in a sense, if you will, and I don't like the word sacrifice. It generates a lot of negative connotations, but it's that give and take for a little bit for everything that can be on that landscape. And maybe not everything is everywhere on the landscape, and that is that balance of multiple use. But grazing, we take that into consideration. There's regulations about increasing permitted use or decreasing permitted use that we can, for drought, fire, other natural causes. Again, conditions for range improvement. We may require or ask the permittee to put in range improvements, or we may partner with him if we see the need to better distribute livestock or provide other range improvements that improves our ability to manage those animals on the ground for land health productivity. We have conditions for qualified applicants. And these terms and conditions that will continue on to the next slide talk about a variety of components that we think are important for us to be able to meet those fundamentals of rangeland health. And that can be rotation systems, that can be an expectation of a rider, salting locations, just a myriad of things that on that piece of landscape, the agency and the permittee and the interested publics feel is important and necessary for that management of the livestock. Again, continue modified terms and conditions. I threw one in here. It was interesting, this came up yesterday. There are prohibited acts that have civil and criminal penalties. And one of those is if livestock are in excess of the numbers authorized. Not to bring up old wounds, but I've seen what would happen if we were 1,800% over permitted use on public lands. It gets pretty hairy. We do all this through a proposed and final decision process where the public is involved. We don't really take hardly any actions with this without issuing decisions and allowing the public participation in that. And then again, kind of the caveat for all of these things you see under the 4180 regulations, the fundamentals of rangeland health that came from the 1995 rangeland reform you see is found in the 4100 regs. The 4110, 4120, 3040, all are predicated on us being able to manage for the fundamentals of rangeland health. I hope that's not me, is it? Okay. So just in summary, the grazing program is to promote healthy rangelands, accelerate restoration and improvement, promote the orderly use, improve and development of the public rangelands to establish efficient and effective management of the grazing, and to provide the sustainability for Western livestock industry. So thank you for your time. Maybe one day we'll be talking about these.
One thing I want to have you go over really good, because I'm from back east. And on my place, if I want to drill 20 wells, I can drill 20 wells. If I want to drill 50 wells, I can drill 50 wells. And from being back there, and the majority of people, these water rights is important to the horses, to the cattle, to anything. Would you mind briefly explaining water rights and how they impact the overall use of the range?
So Reg is clapping for a reason, and I'm not a water rights expert, and I would encourage Reg to answer some of that, but
okay. Well, I mean that's good if you'll and then when he gets up, I'll drill him. Okay.
So my official response are water rights are governed by the state of Utah, and since we have a member on the panel, I mean that would be my official response.
All right.
But yes, they are very important, and regardless of what a state law may say, water rights are a right, and we. The agency holds many water rights, the permittees hold many of those water rights, and for a myriad of those interactions, we're able to work together. for the joint purpose of improvement of public lands. And they need water on the ground to have better health for their animals. You need water to put pounds on the hoof and to consume forage. And so our goal is to distribute that water across that allotment to do just that. And many times at the end of those design systems, watering systems, the permittees are willing to add, 50 feet of pipeline into an open tank or a trough, or guzzlers for small game and big game. There's many times where they'll leave their systems charged after they leave their when and where on their allotments, because there'll be animals in there. Now, wild horses raises their dandruff a little bit, to be honest, if they're going to be using it. But for wildlife purposes, they're more than happy to allow that. Again, water rights have a beneficial use, and so we need to make sure that's being used. Well, one thing with the agency is we'll have common allotments, so there'll be 8 or 10 permittees on that allotment, and only 1 or 2 have that water right. So that's why it's increasingly important for everybody to get along with that, so that that water stays for all of those permittees to be able to use that in a shared management kind of perspective.
Good.
If that answers your...
Thank you. Anybody?
Could you just touch briefly, like, on the social economical benefits of public grazing to the state of Utah?
Oh, where's Director Steed? Where's the economist? I don't have numbers in front of me. Again, I think Reg could probably put some numbers to. Sorry to pass the buck to him. But it's extremely important. I know that through, when I worked in the Salt Lake field office, there was an initiative out towards out west here, Grass Creek, Park Valley, northern Box Elder County, northwest Utah, and Senator Bennett provided several $100,000 to look at the ability to keep these small ranching communities in play, and how they're going to be sustained throughout the generation, and what the agency's interaction was if you canceled grazing or you terminated that for a period of time, or in the land use plan you made unavailable, hundreds of thousands of acres, and designated the uses, designated that area for other uses under the Bureau's mission. So I can't give you numbers, but I think if many of these small rural towns, if livestock grazing was to be removed, we would have more neighbors on the Wasatch Front for sure. And you might be able to answer that question.
And what would be some of the ramifications, I guess, to removing, if you were to remove the public grazing from the lands, and what have been some of the benefits of having, I know you touched on water rights, but what have been some of the other benefits of having permittees on those public ranges?
Well, let's start with the positives, Mr. Chairman, for you. I think grazing, the way that we're managing it now, can be used for a lot of different purposes, not only to sustain the livestock industry or to put pounds on the hoof, which is a rancher's ultimate goal. But with the agency right now, we have concepts of targeted grazing. We're using them for fuel breaks, for fuel load removal. We're doing a concept of outcome-based grazing authorizations, where we're trying to work with the permittee to give them as much flexibility as possible. So when we've identified resource objectives that we like to see out there, possibly for sage grouse, possibly for other teeny species, or just the land health itself, that they're able to step back a little bit from the rigid when and where and how and whys to a more flexible approach to say, we need to go here and here and here in this type of rotation this year because that's where the water is, or that's where we got the rains, or that's where sage grouse aren't going to be right now, or that's maybe where the horses are right now, so we can adjust our grazing management system and go there, and we know that resource will move or do something else. And so they're able to kind of maintain some land health, if you will, by having a quote-unquote disturbance. And when I say disturbance, that isn't in a negative connotation. A lot of people think multiple use, because there's a use, it's also a negative impact. We all mow our lawns every week for a reason. Stop mowing your lawn and see what happens. You'll eventually be spraying a lot of chemical to control weeds and other things. I think a level of disturbance is a good thing for the landscape. and that includes horses at a certain level. And so having those ranchers out there, they're also right there. They understand what's going on. They can give historical context to the landscape. They can provide feedback to the agency about what they've seen in the past. They're usually the ones that can give ideas on how to fight fires because they know how they go through their country. There's a local knowledge base there that the agency, with our limited staff anymore, can't get out on the ground like we'd like to anymore. So we may only get out, once or twice a month to an allotment, where they're there every day. So on the flip side, the negatives would be the concept, if we remove that we're going to get back to a perfect condition or a pristine condition, I think is a false impression. Grazing's been occurring on this landscape forever, and again, the goal is to manage that, to make that work within the context of social values, of the Bureau's mission of multiple use, and that includes all species that graze out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sue and Barry, if you're on the phone, if you have a question, ask it now. If not, mute your phone. You're creating a disturbance. Yeah, well, Barry's pretty good at creating a disturbance.
I'm on the phone.
Do you have a question?
Not at this moment in time.
Well, put your phone on mute. There's a little button somewhere on your phone that says mute, M-U-T-E.
I'll give it a try.
Okay, well, this is one of the best parts that we've had, and this give and take has really been good. And I'm looking at the agenda, and the rest of the board meeting is board input. So if you don't mind, I'd like this to go on because this has been really, really good. And besides that, my good friend Jim has a question he wants to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to state for the record also that from a water right issue, you were speaking to that here a few minutes ago, and I'm speaking not for Utah but for Nevada right now. One of the things that was observed with the increase in distribution of horses onto livestock allotments was not just the water competition between horses and livestock. It was the infrastructure that was in place that provided that water. And in some cases, it's the springs that were beat out that quit flowing. And in many cases, though, it was a lot of those projects that were funded by 8100 funds having to do with pipelines and troughs and drinkers and all those kinds of things are just by the nature of how horses gather around those locations and mill around on them and whatnot, they damage them often to the point of where they quit working. And I know that was something that was not only for a livestock standpoint, it was from a wildlife perspective, and a lot of the wildlife guzzlers and whatnot on the ground, that was a big deal, and it created a lot of damage. And I only say that because that's something to keep in mind as we're moving forward with sharing those spaces. But I wanted to state for the record for my friend Dr. Perryman also is that from 30,000 feet, there's a paradigm shift going on right now with regard to the Taylor Grazing Act and what we took as gospel from the 1935 or 34 sustained yield model that was actually spelled out within that, and orderly use, so to speak. And because there has been, when you factor in the changes in water distribution, the time of the year when water comes now, we're in the middle of, I think most states even that don't have water right or water drought issues in terms of inches of water produced, we're all seeing drought or snow droughts. We're seeing a lack of snowpack, which dramatically changes how water is delivered during the season. And it is what that has done though is has changed and shifted the response to the ecosystem on the lands, not only with regard to how we run livestock operations, but how that impacts things like other uses on the land, wildlife and whatnot. And I guess what I'm getting at is with that change in that synergistic impact to the wildlife or to the ecosystem, in your view, Alan, what is the shift in management protocol from the livestock industry regarding that? I know nobody in the country I'm at right now is operating livestock the same way they did 20 years ago. It's all changed dramatically, and I'm just wondering if you could just give us a little overview of that that historical aspect of it.
So yeah, if I'm tracking your question right, and I think we saw yesterday or identified one of the concerns with that change in how water comes and when it comes and in what form it comes is the hauling of the water and the shift that's created for horses and concentrating them in certain areas. I know we have a lot of offices that have the same conversation with permittees who haul water. They might be filling up those existing troughs, and so they're sort of still grazing and managing their operation on that allotment with that historical way that they've been running that rotation. So, you know, I think that's probably something that they think about. I don't know how well or if the agency is dealing with that through the grazing administration, because it's so unpredictable and changing it so often is how do we decide where do we put water developments or where do we take them? There's, you know, and I could only speak, you folks from different areas of the country probably have different interactions, and Nevada's doing certain things to address this, but you know, in Utah, there's been some proposals to consolidate allotments and make, you know, 29 operations into one and run bigger herds quicker through rotations. And we're addressing, you know, there's example of two of those water rights, big water rights that are held by private individuals who are supporting that effort and developing that into storage tanks. So where we can control that flow, and they're putting the troughs on floats. And so now you can strategically or surgically distribute that water where you want that, and not just have a free flow or filling up into that pond where you have, you know, potential for West Nile or whatever else that may come. You know, but as far as the paradigm shift and where grazing might go with that distribution, I'm not sure. Sometimes it's a challenge for us to get that far out ahead because we're trying to renew the permits that are in front of us. I do think through the targeted grazing and the outcome-based grazing, there's a conversation occurring with that, is where do we want to see our resource objectives? Where do we want to be in 10 years on this landscape, 15 years? And what's that going to take? And water distribution is pinnacle to that conversation. But to forecast where we might have it coming or not, it's a challenge.
One little follow-up.
Make it quick.
1 second. In addition to that, to the water side of that, you know, obviously we've had vegetative changes on the public land. We've got invasive weeds, and we have wildfire incidents. It's gone from 54-year averages to 7-year averages now because of the flashy fuels that are out there on the ground, and that is all shifting that paradigm as well in terms of that. And I just wondering, you know, the competition now between users on the ground is becoming much more critical, and I think that's one of the reasons we're here with the wild horse side of it, is because that competition is really starting to equate it into ecosystem degradation. And I know in Nevada, I know that's a big deal for the livestock operators, and I know a lot of the changes that you just described with regard to the permits and whatnot have been voluntary and have been proposed to the agency over and above, you know, what came down from Washington D.C. So.
Thank you, Jim. Just so Daniel don't have a stroke, we're going to go ahead and finish this however long it takes, and we'll take the break after that, and we'll gain back on the lunch. I might not let everybody have an hour and 15 minutes. We may just take 30-minute lunch, but we'll get back on track at lunch. And I promise you, by the closing time, just like yesterday, you were stressing out. We got through in time, and we'll do that again. But things like this is really educational for us on the board, and the interaction that we're having is, I think, what that big word, beneficial, is that word I'm trying to think of? It's very beneficial. And so anyway, so who's up next, Bruce? All right.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to thank Bureau of Land Management for the invitation to present to you today. On behalf of the Governor, our Governor Gary Herbert, and my boss Kathleen Clark, we'd like to welcome all of you to Utah. Appreciate you selecting this as your place to meet and giving us an opportunity to discuss some of the issues that we have. I was asked to kind of cover multiple use and how Utah needs that on our public lands. So I'd like to talk a little bit about healthy rangelands for healthy ecosystems, herds, and economies. It's a big part of Utah's economy. 67% of our state is public lands. So we have very little private land to work with. So every decision that's made by a federal agency has significant impacts on our economy and our ecosystem and our local communities. So we appreciate the opportunity to come here and discuss some of the desires of the state of Utah and how we move forward on this. I think everybody can appreciate that we all love horses. I've worked on this issue for a long time, and whether I'm talking with the ranching community or with the advocacy groups, I've never yet run into somebody that did not love horses. And the question is, how do we manage them, and how do we get to this balance that we can all live in? And I'd like to give you a little background on myself. These are actually our horses when I was growing up. I'm probably one of the few people in my generation that grew up or spent a large part of my childhood without running water, electricity, or telephone. What I did have was about 80 foals every year that I got to train. So that's kind of my background. That's probably why the governor's office asked me to take this on, is that background. I'm not sure that was a blessing, but it does give me some background in how to deal with horses. Also, all 80 mares that we ran on open range year-round. So much different than most people back east on how they train their horses, how they raise their horses. I would say that a good portion of our mares were just as wild as some of the wild horses that you see out on the range. Some probably more so if you were at the Onaki and could actually approach some and get up to where you can touch them. Some of our mares weren't quite that tame. So it gives me appreciation for what some of the challenges are. I'd also say that we were very specific on when we put our herds into a pasture, how much we let them utilize a pasture, and the number of horses that we put in a pasture. And we were very careful about following those principles. And the reason for that is if we didn't, you wouldn't see the grasses that you see underneath the horses. What you'd see is bare dirt. And it's critical to follow those three principles when you're dealing with any livestock, but especially with horses. Horses don't have a cloven hoof, they have a solid hoof. And they're one of the few animals out there, well, the only animal that has that hoof, but they're able to dig through snow, which was great. That's why we could leave ours at a high elevation during the winter. But it also allows them to dig through the dirt, and they can actually dig up the roots and take out a whole plant, and I'll get to that in a minute. But so it's critical that we look at how we're going to manage the horses. As I said, we all support the wild horses. The state of Utah wants to make it clear that we support wild horses, and it's part of the economy, it's part of our culture. It's just something that we enjoy. We know people fly into Salt Lake and go out to the Onaki herd specifically for that. We don't want to disturb that by any means, but this is the picture that we would like to see of the wild horses, healthy herds on healthy rangelands. And we've got some work to do to get there. Because unfortunately, too often what we're seeing in certain areas are pictures like this, and that's what we want to get away with. On the left, you see that's a forage issue, and on the right, it's probably a forage issue, but also a water issue. So we have two different things, and I'd like to discuss those today, and how we properly manage horses for both good rangeland conditions and water conditions. So there was some talk yesterday about the challenges of BLM and multiple use. I don't envy them because it is a big challenge, but their mission is to have sustained and healthy diversity and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. As Alan was saying, that's a discussion that will probably be continued in perpetuity on exactly what that means. And they also have a sustained yield mission. And part of that mission includes energy development, livestock grazing, recreation, timber harvesting, while also ensuring the natural, cultural, and historic resources are maintained for present and future use. There was a lot of discussion about, these horses have been here for a long time as part of the culture. We agree with that, but there's also other cultural uses out there that a lot of these rural communities depend on, and that was logging and grazing and mining. That's the pioneers that came here. They didn't have anything when they got here. So when they got here, they had to figure out, how do we get the timber for building our houses? How do we get the ore? I grew up in Cedar City, and that's where a lot of the iron ore came from. That's why it's called Iron County. But they had to figure out how to get the ore out of the ground, make their tools out of it. And that's part of this historic multiple use that we talk about and why that's so important. We can't have a single use area or a single use on the landscape, because our economy being 67% public lands, that's kind of a death knell for a lot of these rural communities, and we need to keep that in mind. The state supports the multiple use mandate of the BLM. And if we don't have healthy rangelands, then we have impacts onto T&E species. The picture on the left is a sage-grouse. And if we have unhealthy rangelands and we have impacts to the T&E species or any rangeland or any species, then we're not able to do projects like we have on the right. And we have a lot of renewable resources in areas that we have wild horses. But we aren't able to move forward with projects if there's not enough area for the T&E species to survive. We have to have that balance there. And that's why it's critical that we have these healthy rangelands across the landscape. With the wind and solar, a lot of times you can have grazing and stuff underneath that, but with mitigation and stuff that has to occur for the sage-grouse, if we don't have enough healthy landscapes, it starts to impede progress into these other renewable resources. So, as I said, multiple use is critical for the state of Utah. Wild horses and burros are absolutely part of that, but we also have wildlife that we need to maintain, not just the threatened and endangered species. We have all the other species out there, and that's not just big game. That's small animals, rabbits, squirrels, etc., down to crickets, insects, and everything else. It's the whole gamut that we need to look at in wildlife. It's not just the big game, the stuff that's pretty to look at, or the threatened and endangered. It goes right down to, are there enough bugs on the ground? Are there enough mosquitoes? I know that's not what everybody thinks about, but it's part of the system. Recreation is also huge. We have the Mighty Five here in the state of Utah. We are very supportive of our recreation industry. And believe it or not, we have a lot of people that go out to the West Desert. There's a lot of rockhounds that go out there. They also like to see the wild horses. They also, believe it or not, a lot of them like to see the grazing that occurs out there and the cowboys moving their animals from one pasture to another. Water resources, which it sounds like I'm going to get a question on that after my presentation. It's critical for us. We live in a very dry state, and the state does own the water, and we allow the right for people to use that water if it's put to beneficial use. So we'll probably get into that a little more later. Grazing is also a critical impact for local communities, and we also view that in the state of Utah as a cultural and heritage thing that we'd like to protect. It's a very big part of rural communities, as Alan was saying. Some of these areas like Wayne County is 97% public lands, and the vast majority of their income comes from grazing. If they don't have grazing, they don't have the year-round stores and the year-round gas stations that also support recreation during the summertime when they do have some recreation. So grazing is that year-round income that allows some of these rural communities to survive. And then the added benefit are when they get some people traveling through for recreation or things like that. But timber, grazing, and mining, a lot of the year-round jobs that allow them to survive. Thanks. So renewable energy is also a big part, especially in the West Desert. We have wind, solar, and geothermal are all in that West Desert area. And there is not conflict specifically with wild horses and burros, but like I said, if we don't have healthy rangelands, then we get into some of that conflict because we don't have the opportunity to generate some of that. The Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act. I'm not going to go through this because I think the board knows this by heart. But you know what we're looking for is that thriving ecological balance on public lands. So we've had, I just want to go through these slides really quick. 26 years of change on the Wawa. This is a HMA down in southern Utah. You see on the left, there was a reseeding. It was very healthy. Then in 2003, only about half of that was there. And by 2016, we don't see any grasses there. So these are all pictures that come from areas where there are wild horses. Same thing on the Blonde Wash. And that goes back to that discussion we were having a minute ago about sometimes how the horses can operate. This is probably, if there's anything from my slide, this one and another slide that I'd like you to take away, and that's the use of the forage. If you have 50% use, you're pretty good as far as keeping your soil intact. When you get down to 90% use, that's when you start seeing serious impacts, not only to the vegetation, that also impacts your water, because you start getting a lot of erosion, you don't have water retention. And another thing that a lot of people don't think about with grazing is if you keep healthy areas out there, then you also have carbon sequestration. But when you get to 90% use, you don't have any carbon sequestration anymore. So something to keep in mind. I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. The impacts to water in the West. As I said, water is key in these desert communities. And what we're seeing is some significant impacts to the water sources. And it was mentioned earlier, once you start trampling down, and horses do compact the earth harder than a cloven hoof animal. Cloven hoof animal will actually almost till the earth when it walks, but the solid hoof actually compacts it. You can see this, the no livestock grazing in this area for 30 years. You can see how solid the soil's compacted, and that creates not only a desertification of the area, but you also start seeing springs will actually quit running because the soil gets so compacted. This is the other slide I'd like you to take to heart, and this is how wild horses monopolize water sources. So you see the green is use by the horses, and the blue is native wildlife. I stole this slide from somebody else on the panel, so thank them for that. But it shows the impact that wild horses can have. And in this area, we weren't looking at cattle, but I can tell you also from being out on these ranges that if there are wild horses on these water sources, they will also keep the cattle off. So it's another impact to the grazing. But mostly looking at the wildlife issue on that. So how do we achieve AML? Some thoughts that we have. I know this is very aggressive, but with what's going on the range, with water impacts and forage impacts to the range and threatened and endangered species, we're facing some critical challenges, and we'd like to see AML achieved within 3 years. But certainly within 5 to 10 years, that's critical, or else we'll never get ahead of this. Especially the ecological damage. We've got a lot of restoration and remediation to do on the range, and we can't even start doing that until we get down to AML. And we talked a little about what the state of Utah is doing with the Watershed Restoration Initiative yesterday, and we're happy to pitch in on that effort. But until we get to AML, it's pointless to go out and do those projects, because like I showed earlier, we've done those seeding projects. If you're over AML, the seedings just go away, they're unsuccessful. We'd like to see all available fertility control options on the table. Different HMAs will require different solutions. Some will require permanent sterilization, some we can do the darting, but we have to look at them HMA by HMA and see what works in those areas. If you have areas that are really vast, really rugged, you're going to probably have to look at a permanent sterilization solution as part of getting to AML. Remove young adoptable animals. This comes from my background. The younger the animal is, the easier they are to imprint with and the easier they are to train. So we need to concentrate on bringing off those animals that are trainable and they're going to be adoptable. I think it was Protect the Harvest did a futurity this year with some wild horses, and the top sale I think was $17,000. So there's options out there. There's ways to help finance some of this stuff, but we need to get those young, and they started with very young animals. Also, though, we need to retain an adequate number of high-quality young animals for herd viability and genetic diversity. We always kept 3 or 4 of our best fillies, and those were our replacement fillies, and that's how we kept our herd genetically viable. And then every few years, we'd bring in a new stud. So that's how you can also, we only had 80 head, but we always had very good genetic viability by keeping the good young mare. We also brought in some other mares, but there's a way to do that by just bringing in new genetics. And also, I would highly recommend that we look at implementing proven grazing principles in the wild horse and burro program. Now, do we shut off water and try to get them to move to a new area? But with the wild horses, if we don't think about how to move them and how to get them in new pastures and do some kind of rotation with them, we'll always end up with these impacts, localized impacts. So as we do with the grazing community, we have plans, and we plan on when they're going to be in a pasture. Then we move them to the next pasture, and I would just suggest that from being somebody that's done this on the ground, that's one of the solutions. So the last couple of days, I've seen some quotes on that the wild horses and burros are the living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. And I couldn't agree with that more. They are. But that's just one side of the coin. I'd propose that the other side of that coin are the actual pioneers who brought the horses there. And we hear a lot of this discussion about removing the grazing in order to allow more horses to be out there. But I would say those families, like Mr. Yardley's family that have been out here for generations, those are the pioneers that brought these horses to the range. So I hope we can get away from saying it needs to be one or the other. There's enough room out there that they can both survive, but we need to work as partners on that instead of being in conflict with each other all the time. And I appreciate Nancy and her work that she's doing to bring some of that to fruition. And the last thing I'd like to say is Dr. Steed yesterday was talking about trade-offs, and that's where the state of Utah is also. We look at this, we have to have multiple use, and there are trade-offs. And how do we get healthy herds on healthy rangelands while also still allowing renewable energy, grazing, and the other things that are critical for the state of Utah to continue while we also enjoy the wild horses on the range. So look forward to working with you all, and open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reg. Jim, you have a question?
Yeah, just a short. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick question, Reg, you mentioned we all understand that you're from the governor's office, and I'm wondering if there's conversations within that circle that in the process of achieving the recommendations, the 5 that you've just presented to us, is there an appetite on the part of the state and local governments to partner with the federal government to achieve those recommendations?
So yeah, 2 years ago, the legislature put $500,000 towards doing rangeland projects, things like that, and I think $250,000 went in this year, and part of that was for rangelands, another part of that was for some water projects, and then actually for doing some gathers. Now, we have not done anything on the adoption side or fertility side, but I think you would find a willing partner if we can come up with some of these solutions to be partners with you on that. you know, we're great partners on the Watershed Restoration Initiative and the Grazing Improvement Program. That's probably our forte. It has been. We've been doing those projects for a long time. But if there's other things that were needed, yeah, I think we'd be partners.
I think the subject matter experts alone and that ability to provide the specific management direction that necessary for your piece of country in here is crucial in this whole thing. And I think, I would just like to state for the record, I think that this part of the solution to this thing is going to be not only public and private partnerships, as was presented by Nancy, but also state and local partnerships right alongside of it.
Thank you. I would agree with that. In our state and county resource management plans, we refer to that as local ecological knowledge. And, you know, these people have been on the range for 150 years. They know how to manage these areas. And if you see, I would say, in the 40 years that I can remember, and I've been on the range since I was 10, you know, working with my family and buying cattle all across the West, I've seen a marked improvement in many areas in the forage because of the management practices that we use now. That, you know, we're not there in the 20s and 30s, but we're learning a lot, implementing those better management practices, and I think we can bring that to the table on this issue.
Ben, you got a question?
I do. Judging from the historical record of the success of the Wild Horse and Burro program, I think that the possibility of the program getting significantly more unsustainable is very, very real. And currently in Utah, it's 3 times over AML, and there is approximately 800 to 1,000 horses outside of the herd management areas. If populations double every 4 years, you're looking at 2,000 horses outside of HMAs in 4 years, 4,000 outside of HMAs in the next 8 years. The BLM's budget is strapped. I wouldn't plan on them being able to contain it. Does the state of Utah have a plan on what to do with potential exponentially growing horse herds outside of the herd management areas?
So right now our hands are tied with the same regulations that Congress has put on under the Wild Horse and Burro Act. We can't act outside of that. Now it is interesting, under the act, you know, they're supposed to work with our local wildlife division, and we would like to see more cooperation there. But to date, I guess that's why I'm here talking about trying to find solutions, is we recognize this is an exponentially growing problem. And if we don't get ahead of it, that's why our timeline is 3 years. You'll see a lot of 5 and 10-year timelines out there. I don't think we can let it go that far, Ben. I think we've got to get on this right away. And there is a significant impact to our private landowners. You know, as I said, some of these counties are in single-digit private land ownership, and they're still seeing impacts from wild horses. That's not fair to them. And we also have a lot of state institutional trust lands out on these rangelands. Those are funds that go to our school children. Those are also being affected by wild horses and burros. So we have impacts on multiple levels, and no, we can't survive that exponential growth in the wild horses and be economically viable in some of these rural counties. So we'll do everything we can, and you know, we've been back to Washington, D.C. to try and educate people on the impacts that we see in rural Utah. But we need a solution from Congress to allow us to address this.
On those state lands, if there is a horse on state lands and it's not inside of an HMA and it's not inside of an HA, whose horse is that?
It is, to my knowledge, still a BLM's horse. The only thing we can do is call and let them know that it's there, and they're supposed to be there, I think, within 3 days to remove it. But one of the issues these are rangelands, and so when the operator that has the rangeland out there is on the mountain taking care of his cattle during the summer months or harvesting the alfalfa, they might not go out there for a month or two. So there's times when, you know, a rancher's gone back out to his private lands and he's had 40, 50 to 100 horses on his range lands, his winter range land, and they've eaten all the feed. But he didn't know that they were there for, 3, 4, 5 weeks until he goes back out to check on something. And so there are some significant impacts there. So they are still wild horses, and they are still protected under the Wild Horse and Burro Act. About the only thing that we can do is let them know that they're there. And Gus and those guys are usually really good about working on trying to get those horses off the private lands and settler lands. But it's the notification part where these are wide open rangelands. If you've been down to western Utah, southwestern Utah, you know how big it is and how open it is. And those horses have a lot of places to hide, and they'll come out at night and feed, and so there's an issue.
So you're stating that a horse, an unclaimed horse that is on state land, that is not inside of an HMA and not inside of an HA, belongs to the BLM.
So you're talking unclaimed horses or horses that are branded as, so we have two things.
Just
a feral horse?
Just a feral horse.
A feral horse, okay, it's different thing.
That's 40 miles away from the nearest HMA.
So if it's a branded, marked BLM horse, it's under Gus's supervision. If it's a feral horse where somebody, a private individual, took a horse out and just let it out, and it's not a BLM wild horse, then the sheriff can go out there, immediately pick it up, and they have to hold it for a few days, and then they can take it to a market and sell it.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
A little bit, but I'm confused because the horses that are in HMAs are not branded. So if a horse on an HMA left and went 10 miles without a brand, I don't understand why that horse is a wild horse and is the BLM's.
So that's a good question, and I'm going to have to leave that one to Gus or somebody else on how that one's handled, because we can't harass the wild horses.
But I think what he's asking is, how do you know it's a wild horse? How do you know it's not a horse off of the neighboring ranch?
Yeah.
So what Ben is asking is about these horses that are off the range, that are completely away from it. What is the state of Idaho, the state of Utah going to do about it? I almost called y'all Idaho. That wasn't bad.
That's fine. We get along great with our partners to the north.
Would that be better to defer to Gus? Cause
it would.
It's kind of outside your expertise.
It is. I'm going to leave that one to Gus. And I can tell you most of our ranchers are very nervous about disturbing the wild horses, and so they won't do something like that. But Gus, why don't you handle that one?
Sorry, Reg, I just wanted to see you squirm there for a little bit. So, but yeah, Ben. So the answer is, if a horse expands, like we have our populations expanding, they move outside of the herd management area, outside of the herd area, even if they're 10 miles away, those animals are still unbranded, unclaimed. They fall under the Wild Horse and Burro Act. The only exception would be is somebody calls up and says, hey, there's a horse out here in the middle of nowhere. It's not anywhere near a HMA. We go investigate it. We try to determine if it's a feral horse that's been turned loose. Sometimes we'll go out there, we'll see one with a halter mark, or the classic is we go out there and look down, he's got shoes on it. Well, that's obviously not a wild horse. But a horse that's unbranded, unclaimed, on public lands falls under the Wild Horse and Burro Act.
Is there a brand law in Utah?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Yes, and we work really closely with the state of Utah, our brand inspectors, and they help us investigate these cases if there's any questions, and so we can determine, are they wild horses or are they private feral horses?
Okay,
so
good. Dr. Peterson, don't panic. You're going to get your full time and you're going to be as grilled. You're going to be grilled just as much as these folks are.
So that statement that a horse that is unclaimed on public lands is a wild horse, that is a big statement. Where is that at? Where is that written at in the act?
We'll have to dig it up for you.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just, that fascinates me that a horse that's unclaimed that could be 200 miles away from the nearest HMA under that definition would be considered a wild horse.
All right.
So if you get 200 miles away, that's probably, you have to investigate each one independently, but you've got to use reason
Mr. Chairman, in the state of Nevada, everybody knows where the Virginia range is. That's where the Wild Horse and Burro Act originated with Wild Horse Annie. She was talking about the Virginia range at the time, and that's much of the Virginia range is state land. And the Bureau of Land Management, there's a significant herd of horses on the Virginia range, always has been, at least in recent history. And the Bureau of Land Management relinquished, the question was asked them, are those your horses or are those somebody else's horses? The same question you just asked. Bureau of Land Management, no way. And we had got an opinion through our Attorney General just recently, Department of Justice, that those horses belong, in fact, to the state of Nevada, and the management is going to have to originate in the state of Nevada. They're going to take responsibility on those horses, and that's why the controversial discussions about sale without restriction in Nevada on that Virginia range population came up.
Okay. Tom?
So are they held within the confines of the Act on those horses?
What was that again?
Are they held within the confines of the Act as
No,
to what they can?
not at all. They had sale. They were completely independent of that.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment, and I want to commend you on one thing you said that I think is often overlooked. That's where you said that they retain an adequate number of high-quality young animals. I've been on a couple of gatherings where they return part of the animals they gather to the range, and I'm not critical of the folks that were in charge because they were range grass managers, they weren't horse people, but they were returning horses. And I understand this from an adoption perspective, that were paints, palominos, buckskins, pretty horses that people like to adopt. But a lot of those horses were club-footed or bench-kneed or calf-kneed or had straight stifles. And those are significant defects that will always lead to early lameness, and I'm sure in wild horses, early death. And so I'm not sure what the solution is. I'm sure we could put together an educational booklet for the people that run the gatherings to help them identify those type of defects, because they do have consequences. And I just want to commend you for bringing that up, because it's a very good point that hasn't been discussed before.
Thank you. And if I could add to that, during some discussions I've had with folks, is they were concentrating on those adoptable animals and bringing them off, as many as they could. And my point to them was, leave some of those genetic markers in your herd so that what you're developing long-term are adoptable animals. Don't leave, if whatever your negative traits are, if you leave those long-term, you have less adoptable animals. So I agree.
And I think also one of the issues that we faced is a lot of true good horse people traditionally haven't adopted wild horses. Now, there's been some great effort to correct that with the Mustang makeover and so forth, and I told the fellow on the range that day, horsemen want horses that are going to remain sound. And so even though the horse is pretty, if he's got bad knees or he's got hoof problems, they're not going to adopt that horse. And we need to encourage people that are in the horse business that know how to train and ride horses to adopt these horses.
Thank you very much. That was a good program. All right. Dr. Peterson?
Are you ready?
As
Is that
they-
working there?
As
Perfect.
as they said in a Western I watched, shoot, Luke, you're loaded.
I'm ready to start shooting. Let's go. That'd be great. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you. This has been great opportunity to think these things through a little bit and come up with some ideas. And mostly my background is in rangeland ecology and management. And so today I'm going to focus on a lot of ecological principles that tie to range ecology. And thank you. I don't know if you've ever seen this book of Jerry Holacek that's called Rangeland Management Principles. And if you don't own one, I highly encourage you to go buy it.
I've got it.
Keep it on your shelf. You might want to put it on your coffee table and read it once in a while. It's a beautiful book. It talks about some major fundamental thoughts about how we conserve range. And so my focus today is going to be talking about some of those. In that book, it talks about the main conservation for rangeland resource practices that we have, and they are to sustain rangeland renewable resources. That is a fundamental part of range management. To maintain green plants and to capture solar energy and to sustain grazing animals, to maintain these ecological processes is really critical, and in maintaining that should be a focus of management efforts. And then to provide protection of soil, water, vegetation, and then to sustain these multiple uses that Reg has talked about, that is a key part of rangeland management. And with that, we have to talk about the things that keep these rangelands sustainable. They are precipitation, which is the single most important factor in determining the type and productivity of plant communities. And with that are soils, that we protect soils, we understand them, and realize they have a huge influence on the ability for plants to persist and to respond. And when we think about ecological practices and principles, we ought to think about resilience as well as resistance to these types of disturbances, and goes right along with what Reg was just saying. And so I put this map together. This is of all the HMAs in the West United States. And if you look at the map of, this is from, I can't see the dates on there, but about 30, 40 years, something like that, is the average annual precipitation in the United States. And if you look at that variability in red there, that red is primarily the driest parts of the state. And if you look at Nevada, where we have most of our horses, we have quite a few in Utah, and that all occurs right there in that more arid environment. And because you've got this relationship between where the horses are at, where rangelands are at, and these conditions, it's really important to think about the influence of the environment and its ecological responses and the resiliency of these sites, these plant communities. Also, a major principle of range is to consider potential disturbances, and one of them is looking at animal density. It is the most important of all grazing management decisions. That has to deal with the frequency, the timing, the duration of grazing, and how that can influence the plant communities that are there. And I liked Reg's picture of the plants that he had on there showing total grazing, and not total grazing, but the influence of plants in response to grazing, having to deal with total amount that was utilization. And what happens, these plants, which have evolved under grazing over long, long time periods, they are adapted to survive and persist with grazing, but as they continue to be grazed on, they have to draw from carbohydrate reserves. And if you keep overgrazing, not overgrazing, but utilizing those plants again and again, they only have so much of that they can draw from. And over time, that can have a detrimental effect, and that's what we saw in that picture where the root's not able to persist because they are drawing from carbohydrates to maintain that biomass. Some plants are very adapted to that. Crested wheatgrass can respond very effectively to grazing over time. Others that are native grasses, like blue bunch wheatgrass, is not nearly as tolerant, and enough hits of grazing in a time period, especially when they're vulnerable, can have a very deleterious effect on that plant and its ability to persist on a rangeland. An important topic as well is this carrying capacity. These ecosystems are tolerant of a disturbance, but over time, not a disturbance, but utilization, over time you can exceed what they can actually support and maintain. And so you think about stocking rates. Your goal is to not overdo this, to cause damage to vegetation or these resources that go with them. And part of that is, again, maintain these ecological processes that are tied to the structure that you see on an environment like this. So the emphasis is then to maintain these community-level interactions so you can maintain the plant community that stabilizes soils, it allows for infiltration rates, you get nutrient cycling, all these processes that are very fundamental for rangeland integrity and health. So with that, we consider what has been stated as far as how we manage our horses. The BLM has come up with appropriate management levels with the goal, this is in the handbook, to maintain a balance of free-roaming horses and burros with wildlife, livestock, wilderness, and recreation. And then if you look back at the 1971 Act, a statement that was made was the goal is to maintain a thriving natural ecological balance. And when I was on the panel, this committee for the National Academy of Sciences, we talked a lot about what that means and how do you maintain this thriving natural ecological balance. And it's an important thing to consider. And the number of animals, whatever they may be. It's just an herbivore in general. It doesn't have to be a horse. It can be anything like we've already heard about, livestock. It doesn't matter what it is. As long as you're grazing these plants and having that effect, you need to consider what that stocking rate means as far as the resilience of these sites. So just for fun, I pulled this up. This was off of the BLM website. This shows the different states. This is for a report from March 2018. And it shows the total number of horses by state and total number of burros, and then their total. And I thought, well, compare that to 2017. How much is that? Are we seeing a change? And these are the results. Every state except for a couple. There's Montana in there and Utah as well that actually have a decrease in total number of horses. But the rest are continually increasing. I did the same thing from 2017 to 16, and we continue to see an increase in total number of horses. Maybe more important is this discussion about AML and what percent of horses are there above AML in these different sites. And the only one that's below it right now is Idaho. The rest are all above, and overall for the total, down at the bottom right, is 207% above AML. And that goes back to this concept or discussion about stocking rates and how that affects these lands and what that means to us long term. So I want to show you a few things that have come out of the scientific data collection recently. This is a site up in northwestern Nevada. That fencing is great for doing studies. You don't have to get an EIS to put that stuff up. It's called Liberty Fencing. So as part of a team, there were several of us involved in this study. We developed these exclosures. We have 5 different exclosures across what's called the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. Gail Collins was the biologist out there who's done a lot of work on horses in the past. And as you can see on the left side is where it's exposed to grazing. On the right is excluded from grazing. We had a group out of the ARS in Oregon. And this piece of information right here is from Dr. Davies with Gail Collins and also Chad Boyd, who have reported on their 5-year study of the effects of horse grazing, comparing excluded versus non-excluded. And basically, herbaceous cover and density generally did not differ between grazed and ungrazed treatments from their study. What they did find was that horse-grazed areas had lower sagebrush density and plant diversity, greater soil penetration resistance, and lower soil aggregate stability. What that implies to those who would read this is that you have to be careful that it may have an effect, right? So the last bullet there says horses may have an effect on the ecological function of semi-arid rangelands, with a risk to exposing soils to impact and potential hydrologic processes that occur. That was published in 2004, and I've got a copy of that paper right here, and I can hand it to you if you'd like to have that. I just made one, though. I should have made a bunch, but I've got that for you. I'll give you the whole pack. I've got a whole bunch of papers right here that discuss this stuff. And so on the right there, you can see the graph, soil aggregates versus soil surface penetration. Both of those are showing a significant difference in total amount between grazed and exclosed sites. And then that same team of people, they put together this study, which was looking down. So the past one with Davies was looking at the upland areas. This study was down in the riparian community. And again, 5 years, same location, 5 different exclosures to show replication in this. And what they found is that if you consider cover, also the density of plants, that there is an effect. So bare ground in grazed areas was much higher, significantly higher, and then with litter, significantly lower. So again, even in riparian systems, there are these effects that can occur. And the next graph shows you this, which is stubble heights and visual obstruction for potentially hiding cover for species that are there with them. Should be considered, and that is for plant community analysis. This next set of slides is from work that was done by Luke Hall. He was a PhD student out of BYU and with advisors of Brock McMillan and Randy Larson. And Reg, this is some of the stuff you were talking about. What they did is they put fences, or they had areas that were fenced off to horses out at Dugway Proving Grounds. That's here in western Utah out in the Great Basin. And they wanted to see what difference you would see in areas that had horses that were able to access these water sites versus those that were excluded. And this image here is showing you the total number of visits of wildlife at a site. And on the left is your horse excluded sites, and on the right are included. And that's just a total number of visits for wildlife species. And if you break it down into individual species that do show up, on the left is showing you again excluded sites where you've got significantly higher number of species that are occurring at these sites where they are excluded. 3 minutes? Got it, that's perfect. So the thought is that you think about the size of these animals. They are large-bodied animals, and again, it's not just picking on horses. It could be any large herbivore. It's just an interaction between animals. We did a study, my graduate student out in the same location, not as this one, but out in Nevada, where we looked at pronghorn. She sat up on the hillside and observed pronghorn and horse interactions. And 50% of the time, when horses showed up, pronghorn would vacate the water source. And our thoughts, for the most part, is because of that size. They just can't compete with that. A pronghorn's 100, 150 pounds, somewhere around there, and a horse is going to be 1,000, 1,200 pounds, and it's a body size issue. And this is the one that Reg just showed. Same concept, but I want to make sure that we understand what this is saying, that in the summer months when water becomes a scarcity and animals need that water resource, that's when horses are found at the greatest time periods. Those are showing you the amount of time the horses will stay at a water hole and utilize that water, which can potentially displace other species. A couple slides left, and that is, this is a description of state and transition theory. And a very important concept is that when a site has a potential disturbance, whatever that may be, over time that disturbance may cross ecological thresholds, which suggests that it takes energy, it could be time and money and extra management to drive these ecological sites back to the way they were historically. The goal in rangeland management is to not cross ecological thresholds if at all possible. And that comes down to doing risk assessment. And so for sites that are potentially being utilized by herbivores of whatever type, that needs to be considered very carefully, that sites like this are not being permanently damaged. I was just about a month ago in Australia at Brumby Week, which is a very interesting week to have with the Australians, where they invite people all over to come and talk about Brumby impacts, and they've got over 1 million Brumbies that they are estimating. Dave Berman says about 1 million Brumbies in the whole country. And there's an area where they've removed horses, and they still, over the last 3 to 4 years, have not really seen much of recovery. And we haven't quantified that, but it begs the question, how much can they tolerate before they start to cross these thresholds and might not rebound like the way you would like to see them recover. So the thought then is to become educated, to be able to understand what these ecological processes are all about. Knowing what the principles are like and how you impact those, I think, are really critical. And the manager can apply those, understand that knowledge, to making real fundamental decisions in maintaining these landscapes. And from that, you're able to make predictions about what those impacts might be. In ecological site descriptions that have been produced in many states, I know for Nevada, they've got a lot of ecological site descriptions that have been generated with state and transition models that allow you to make predictions of what happens when you cross those, and what would that condition be like, and what does it take to get them back. I think that's a real fundamental part of this. And with that, if you have any questions about this, I'm more than happy to answer those for you.
I'd just like to comment, Dr. Peterson, I think of all the information that's been presented the whole time we've been here, a fundamental understanding of what you've just talked about is the most important thing we've heard about yet. Having been a student of Dr. Bounds and knowing the significant impact that the rangeland resource has on so many different animals and so many different people, what's at stake here with the excess population of wild horses is astronomical. And I would hope everyone would take an opportunity to review this information and look it over. But could you just touch on, and you kind of have, but you brushed over this transition that occurs when there is a threshold, an ecological threshold that's crossed. What are the ramifications long term on these arid desert communities of crossing that threshold, and how long does it potentially take to return back to that pristine state it was in to begin with?
I love that question. That's a great one. I teach that to my students at BYU all the time. And it's just because of 8 to 10 minutes, it's just not enough to really go into great detail. But what happens is these sites are sustained. So you've got plant communities that exist with both abiotic and biotic components, right? So you got your plants, you've got your litter in the soil, decomposition rates are all occurring. You've also got water and infiltration in soils and soil structure. All that goes together. So they maintain these processes, which are nitrogen cycling and the hydrologic cycle, or ability of plants to capture energy and convert it from a radiant form into a chemical form. These are all real fundamental parts of maintaining an ecosystem. As sites become degraded for whatever the cause is, it can cause that disruption to those processes. The discussion of what a threshold is, it's got some wiggle room, right? It's really hard to define with strict numbers. And so the goal is to figure out about where that starts to see, where you see this decoupling of these ecological processes, which could mean you start losing infiltration rates, you get higher runoff, which has greater sediment content in that runoff. That's a concern. You're going to start losing your soils. Potentially, you can go from what's called an abiotic or a biotic threshold, where you cross that, where you lose your ability of your plant community to stay functional, into an abiotic threshold, which is where you start to lose soils and the ability to infiltrate water, and those are much, much harder to recover from, these abiotic thresholds. Especially when you lose soils. If you cut down and you lose your O horizon, you get your A horizon that's lost, to recover that over time can be a long process. If you think about how soils are formed, that takes a long time, especially in the semi-arid and arid environments that I was showing on this map. That, if you let it go long enough, you could talk hundreds, if not thousands of years of recovery unless you'd go do something about it. And so many of the discussions we have is kind of, you could say it's more about triage, figuring out those sites where you really can put your money into something and have it work so that you don't see this long-term impact. But the goal is we have a lot of effort. We make a lot of effort to do things like restoring rangelands. We do reseedings, stuff, anything we can do to try to implement this recovery and to maintain these processes that take place. Is that a fair enough answer to that question?
Yeah, maybe just to touch up on that. What is the cost involved and the success rate of in these arid communities, when you talk about trying to overcome those thresholds through man-made manipulations such as reseedings and the various things that you can do to try and get that back to a state where you'd like to see it, especially when you're involved with millions of acres that we're talking about. What are the costs involved in that?
I don't know if you've ever gone and tried to price out seed. When they go out and do seeding operations, the cost is outrageous, especially in the western, the Great Basin environment in particular. These lands are dry. Nevada is 10 inches or less per year as an annual average precipitation. And if you think down in some of these low elevation rangeland environments where it could be 5-6 inches per year, the ability to seed and have that seed germinate and be successful and established is tough. And if you get 1 to 5% success in your seeding, then your average may be pretty good. Sometimes they have less than that. And so it costs a lot to go out and do seeding and to have it work and be a successful thing. That leads into a discussion about, the whole business of what kind of plants you even seed out there, because some will persist, some don't do well. It's a challenge. It can be a very expensive operation.
Did you say 1 to 5% success rate is
There are examples
adequate?
of that. Yeah, that's not an atypical success in a seeding effort for dry, arid rangelands. That'd be typical.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Celeste, you woke up.
I woke up. Well, I like this kind of stuff, so I was listening.
It is a fun topic, isn't it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Peterson, I just wanted to recognize and appreciate what you said about, this is in particular a wild horse study, but it does not preclude, other large hoofed ungulates, and that in terms of, there's just as many studies about cattle on rangeland, and the point of these studies is not to place blame at all. It's to figure out how to better manage. We need better information about horses on our public lands, so that we're doing the right thing in the best way that we can, and I firmly support that, so thank you.
Great, I agree with that.
Anybody else have any questions? Board, I'd like to really appreciate you coming, and you've done a good job. I mean, when this first come out, you and I had some talks about this, and I was a bit apprehensive, but this was great. I didn't ask you if you had a question.
Trust me on that.
I do trust you. I do trust you. But this was really, 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 really good. This is the first time we've ever done anything like this, and it was really, really good. I'm serious. I've really enjoyed it.
I hope the rest of the board feels the same.
I think they do. I think
Not
they
that
do.
I discount you, Fred, but
I think they do. I think they do. Daniel. That's what I was fixing to do next. Sue, are you on the phone?
Mr. Chairman, this is Barry. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Do you have a question?
I have a quick question. I just went through the Green River Tunnel, so I lost everything. I have a quick question for Dr. Peterson. Could you explain that, you were talking about Dr. Davies' study up at the Sheldon. Could you explain for the public very quickly, or reiterate once again, because you did it earlier in your talk, that there is no such thing as grazing, or there is no such thing as grazed or ungrazed. It's always in some context of timing, duration, and intensity.
Yes, I can address that. That going back to that fundamental principle in the beginning, that is what matters the most. And if there is an ability to manage animals and how they use these landscapes, that is when you're going to have most effective use. As I mentioned, these plants, especially these perennial grasses, they've evolved with this, but they're also sensitive to the way they're grazed. And the timing of grazing is really important, how often they're grazed. And again, that goes with both uplands and riparian systems. You can go in and you can graze riparian systems every year, you can, and that's not a problem. But if you hit them again and again, over and over, that can be an issue. That's a big problem. Also, if you graze them when it's during a very critical growing period, when they're producing their inflorescence, they're utilizing a lot of their resources to do that. And if they get nipped off, then they can handle that, but they can't handle it over and over, and especially in one growing season. So they are vulnerable. Again, they're adapted to those conditions, but they're vulnerable to them as well. And so being able to keep your animals in areas where they can be, where the plant community can be best benefited over time is a real important thing to consider. I don't know if I answered the question or not. Let me think what else was on that. What else did you ask about that? I don't know if I got the whole thing. Anyway, that's good. And that's some stuff for you to think about. But it was about gradients, right? About this over time period. You have to be able to understand that there are going to be animals in there, and yeah, there's different levels of grazing intensity. And horses, from my perspective out the Sheldon, they'll move along. They'll hit this riparian area, these seeps or springs, and they'll move on to the next one. So there's movement going on. But again, it's this interaction between the grazer and the plant community that's there that ought to be thought about at least. And it's, again, about herbivory and how plant communities respond to herbivory in particular.
Okay. Barry, can you hear me? Barry? Barry? Sue? We don't have anybody on now. All right. Okay.
I can hear you. I heard most of what Dr. Peter spoke of, and I just wanted to just add very quickly that the study up on the Sheldon, although there was no real major differences between the two tree guts, it was only true under that specific grazing scenario of timing, duration, and intensity. If you change that timing, duration, and intensity, you can expect a movement one way or the other, depending on whether it was more intense or less intense.
Yeah. Thank you, Barry.
I could say one more thing about that, and that is, there were a number of horses. The Sheldon has had up to, in the past, 1,000, 1,200 horses on it. The study was occurring mostly around the Badger Mountain area, and so there were a number of exclosures that were set up in different spring areas, springs and creeks, like small riparian areas. But this is a very arid environment as well. It's a lot like what you see in that picture. That's not it. That's next door. That's over in the Roaring Springs Mountain area of Steens Mounds. But anyway, so that area did have horses that varied in the number, and they were doing some roundups at the time, and so intensity of grazing actually did change a little bit over time, and I believe it actually states that in this document. But you can go through that and read that paper, and I've got both of them here, both the Davies and the Boyd paper that describes that process, or how they set that up. But there was, that was a discussion they had as well, is how many horses are there? Are they staying in the area? Are they moving on, coming back? And I don't believe they really carefully looked at the exact number of animals that were present all the time. We did have some cameras up that were taking pictures of these horses, so we knew they were coming in consistently and using those sites. We actually do have that data we can go back and look at.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Board, at this time, I think we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And then when we get back, there's a change in the agenda, not much of a change, but for the next couple hours, we're going to have working group reports, but we're also going to talk about some recommendations and try to formulate some of those. We aren't going to finalize them, but we're going to talk about. I didn't say you could leave. We are adjourned for 10 minutes.